All right, we have arrived. You, me, and the ether between us. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Thank you, whoever you are. Glad you're here. Welcome, new person, if that's you. What's up, the rest of y'all? How was your week? Mine felt a little less doom to it than previous week. How about you? Did your week have a little less feeling of doom to it? No, really, it did feel like all the numbers are going in the right direction and the vaccinations are rolling out. And it does seem like maybe we're heading in a better direction. And I don't want to shit on that. Let's take that for what it is. And along those lines, I want to also thank everyone who reached out to me and left comments, feedback on the blog post I wrote. Most people seem to appreciate some of the things I was observing and thinking about, but I also did get some pushback. Mainly from independent center owners who I think felt like I dissed them. Shout out to Dana Bushman, my old friend who showed up in the teacher's class recently. I can always count on Dana to hold my feet to the fire. And you know, I could see how if you were an independent center owner out there and you've been struggling to keep your doors open, or maybe you had to close your doors, but you did everything that you could. And then you read my post and I'm all like, yeah, whatever, centers, we don't need ya. That could kind of feel shitty. And it certainly wasn't my intention to do that. If you read my previous blog post, Love Letter to Yoga Land, I talked about how, in my experience, the people in the yoga world are pretty fantastic, actually. And I didn't mean to diss the independent owners at all. Definitely not. I was just talking about the model, the growth model, and the center that felt more like a scene than a home, you know? But I want to express my solidarity with all of the people out there who are holding it down. And you know, I really hope that I'm just wrong about stuff. Like a year from now, we look back at all of this and we go, can you believe that happened? That would be great. But I guess for myself, I'm always a little bit skeptical or cynical minded sometimes. And I think I game out in my mind situations to sort of prepare myself emotionally and mentally for things. If I'm wrong, all the better. And I really do think that there's going to be centers. I hope there has to be. Of course there will be. I guess I'm just thinking about all the teachers who've reached out to me over this last year. We're just talking about this in the teacher's class this week. Like, how do you get new students in this new online world? If I'm all on my own and I don't have a center, how do I meet new students? And what about just the real value of having a place where you have friends and you go there on your weekly class or your, you know what I mean? Or those regulars who go every day and there's that whole thing that happens, you know? Some of the best years and days and moments of my life were at yoga centers. The one that I had for 10 years was it was a glory decade for me to have that. And I believe that there will always be centers. I guess I just also know that the way that we were doing it before was not sustainable, and we just need to be clear about that. Like, those centers have a shelf life. They just do, unless we figure out some other way to do it. And I'm just interested in other ideas. Like, can we be more collaborative? Do we always have to have it be the way that it was? Is there a more shared space way like I'm exploring right now myself, and I'll talk about that more some other time. But in any case, to any of the people who are listening to this who are yoga center owners who read the blog and felt dissed, I do apologize. I don't want to diss any of y'all. I appreciate all of y'all out there who are doing your best to teach from your hearts and help people in your community and share in your yoga with people. So, for whatever that's worth, really appreciated all the conversations I was having off air this week through email and otherwise. I will say that in all the conversations I had this week, it definitely felt like people were looking towards trying to move back into some more semblance of normal. People are getting vaccinated. I saw for the first time in a long while people taking registrations for retreats. It's like, let's all get the shot and I'll meet you in Tulum. I don't blame anybody, you know. It's been a year, and like I said, I don't want to shit on anything, and I'm happy for us all to do what needs to be done to see if we can undo some of this isolation and just re-socialize again. I know that I just miss being around people. I miss being around people. And I really look forward to the day that we'll come together again. In the meantime, I have a fantastic talk to share with you today with Gregor Maele. Gregor has been on the show before, but it has been a couple of years. He's got a new book that he just put out. It's called How to Find Your Life's Divine Purpose. And boy, did we get into it. There's so much here to contemplate and to ground us and to give inspiration and clarity. So I'm very thankful to have had this conversation with Gregor. I'm very glad that you're going to get to hear it today. Real quick before we do, let me just give a shout out to our podcast premium subscribers. People like Brenda Leifso and Ali Christoph. We are very grateful to our podcast premium subscribers, people like Brenda and Ali, and everyone else who has chosen to support the show. And also you get access to the full archives, but it is really the best way to help us keep this going. It's a choose your rate thing, and you can cancel at any time. If you're in a bad way right now and you don't have any money, you can just email us. We will totally give you a free account. But if you are in a position to contribute even just a little bit, it really makes a difference, and we are grateful. You can find out about becoming a podcast premium subscriber along with all of my stuff, this teacher's class I keep going on about, as well as my regular live stream classes and all of my on-demand stuff. Everything I'm doing right now can be found at jbrownyoga.com. All right. I think that's fine. I will touch base with you on the other side, maybe, share a few other things that have been going on, like father stuff's going on. I got some father stuff going on, y'all, but we'll leave it till the other side because we've got a lot to get to today. So let's do that. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Gregor Maele. Hello, are you there?
Hi, Jay. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Gregor.
Great to talk to you again after that long time.
I know. I was just thinking that it's lovely to speak with you again. I just checked right before coming on with you. It's been just over 2 years since we were last here together.
Yeah, time passes so quickly, doesn't it?
It really does. And how much has happened and changed in this last 2 years?
Yeah, if you would have got me to forecast anything of this, I wouldn't have tipped anything right.
No, how could we have?
Yeah,
I'm wondering, my memory's not always so good, but I have a recollection that when I last spoke with you, you lived in a somewhat removed and tropical place. Is that right?
that's right. Yes, it's a tropical rainforest. That's where we still live. Yeah,
And tell me again, where is that?
it's it's the easternmost point of the Australian east coast. So it's about 1,000 kilometers north of Sydney, and there's a backpacker resort here, for lack of a better word, called Byron Bay.
Right.
And we live half an hour to 45 minutes from there in the bush.
Okay. I've been to Byron Bay, so I.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And that also gives me a sense too, because my next question was going to be how for you personally have you been impacted by this pandemic? I hate that I have to ask that always, but I feel like I'm always curious to hear how it's been for people.
Yeah, look, it's sort of been very strange. One is because, we live on 150 acres here in the middle of the jungle. So it hasn't really impacted us that much because we have this enormous amount of freedom here. But then on the other hand, it's been really, really strange for me to not be able to leave the country. Yeah. Which is sort of feels double weird for me because I'm German born, and I was born in West Germany. And at the time, whenever we were critical towards the political regime, they said us, well, why don't you go over to East Germany, to communist Germany, and you can see that they are not free because they're not allowed to leave the country. So that was for me always the yardstick for freedom. As was told to me by my elders, if you can't leave your country, which was back then called Republic Flight, then you were defined as being not free. And so here I am. It's sort of like, it makes me a little bit nervous. On the other hand, there's this thing that I've been thrust back into my writing. I'm just working on the second book during the pandemic, which has been totally fantastic. So, I can't really complain.
Right. But I hear what you say about the travel. So much of what I was doing had involved travel before this happened. And
yes.
And even now it's hard to know when we'll be able to travel again.
Yeah, I don't think in a hurry,
No, it's not clear.
No, it's not clear.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. One of the things that's been happening for me during this pandemic is, a real clarifying of important things. And some of the words that have been coming up a lot are, purpose and beliefs, and a lot of conversation just around like intuition and a sense of knowing. Yes. And I saw that you've got this new book out, How to Find Your Life's Divine Purpose. And it seemed like you were writing about a lot of these things too.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it deals really with all of the things that you just mentioned.
Well, I guess I was looking at, you just put out in particular an excerpt just recently, just the other day, and it was saying, I believe this principle that you wrote, any set of beliefs consistently held will produce correlated outcomes.
That's right.
And I thought that was particularly relevant for the moment.
Yes.
And you wrote about how our minds are equipped with perceptual filters.
That's right.
And that the purpose of them is our survival. Can you say something more about that?
Yes. Look, this particular sentence that you're just quoting, I'm essentially harking back to a book written by Aldous Huxley called The Doors of Perception. I think he would have probably written that in the 1960s. And in that book, Huxley proposed, and I think that he's completely right, that the brain, by and large, is a reduction valve to something which I call it cosmic mind, yeah, which, if you remember that also in yogic philosophy and in Sankhya philosophy, intelligence is called buddhi, yeah, which comes from the same verb root as buddh, to awaken, or buddha, the awakened. So let's call it cosmic intelligence. And that is something that is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Yeah. For example, there's one common intelligence that expresses itself through photons, quarks, black holes, computer chips, the biosphere, the way how the oceans, the atmosphere, and organisms work together, and also the human brain. All of that is an expression of one and the same intelligence, which we may find, in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, in Homer's Ilias, in the Vedas, in the work of Shakespeare, etc., etc. We find it everywhere. Yeah, and so
in a flower blooming, right?
Totally, everywhere in nature, we have this enormous intelligence that all of nature, all of matter is nothing but crystallized in intelligence. And one of the stark examples that I often give is the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, which is essentially a machine which did cost, I don't know, $1 trillion, and it's 24 kilometers in diameter. It's an elementary particle accelerator. And we have built this thing to basically make minute particles visible, like the Higgs boson particle, the so-called God particle. And so it's funny that on one hand, we have already realized that matter is so incredibly intelligent that we have to build $1 trillion machine, and we still don't understand matter. We're just scratching at the surface of what matter actually is. Yet at the same time, we are sort of walking around and using terms like dumb and dead matter, as if matter is nothing. Yeah. So the basic idea is that the whole universe, all matter and all beings within it, is a material crystallization of a cosmic superintelligence. And of course, this is what in some scriptures has been called God. And so the problem with the term God is that it was often anthropomorphized. That means when we think about God today, we're thinking about a bearded white male in sitting on a cloud that is cranky and sometimes throwing down how do you say, lightnings,
thunderbolts,
floods, and then maybe sending a plague or locusts. So it's definitely like a cranky white old male. and this is sort of like we have projected human characteristics onto the divine. Yeah. And whereas in fact, it is cosmic intelligence, and you can see it everywhere. Yeah. Now, the human brain, as Aldous Huxley has described that so eloquently, is a reduction valve on cosmic intelligence. Yeah. So that means if you would open this reduction valve entirely for you to be able to let the entirety of cosmic intelligence come through, well, it wouldn't even theoretically be possible. Yeah. It wouldn't theoretically be possible, because our entire universe or multiverse, now we know that there are several universes, is the state of having the reduction valve completely open. It leads to a manifestation of an infinity of forms. Yeah. So now,
I saw that you wrote that you said that to see the full reality would make us dysfunctional.
Yes, totally. So the only thing, if you have that come through everything at once, you'd be pinned down to the floor. You couldn't even stay in your body. Yeah, it would be literally impossible to perceive that, the all, the entirety, and yet be in the body. Yeah, so you'd have immediately an out-of-body experience, and your sense of self would be blown up to about the size of the universe. Yeah.
Right, like
And
a
this,
DMT experience or something like that.
yeah,
Like,
absolutely, absolutely. And this is exactly what people like Buddha or Lao Tzu or Krishna or Jesus Christ actually experienced. And then the question is, how do you actually bring yourself back? And how do you cast into words which is totally inexpressible? Yeah. And so then comes the reduction valve into power, which then clamps down on your experience until from this giant river that you have just seen, in Buenos Aires, we have the Rio de la Plata, which is 120 kilometers wide at the diameter. Yeah. So instead of having this massive river, you have this minute trickle of words that enables me now to speak. Yeah. Because at any given time, my brain now functions only, focuses on a minute snippet of information with the purpose that I can actually focus on it and I can verbalize it, which if I see the whole picture, I can't. And particularly what I cannot do is I cannot say, oh, Gregor hungry, Gregor must eat. Yeah. So it's not possible. Yeah. Because, you can only ever see the entirety of the cosmos, or you can, attend to your survival needs.
I get it. It just seems like it's such an interesting idea, though, because often, like in yoga circles or when I've talked with people, there is this idea of wanting to be able to perceive or see reality in its entirety or in its fullness. But that does sort of mean, and sometimes I've heard that even talked about when I've had people on to talk about Patanjali's sutras, and if the goal is essentially like the end of what being human is, in a sense, sort of like what you're describing is that the goal of yoga is to reach this full experience of reality, this transcendent experience of reality where you're no longer bound by these, phenomenal realms here. And then other people would say the sutras are saying something different, of course. I've had people say a lot of different things. But what you're saying is not sound like anything I want. Like I feel like this life's been given to me for a reason.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And the Yoga Sutra actually states that the final outcome of whatever you're going to do is this, let's just call it the hypothetical final endpoint of your individual life. Yeah. And that's also what the Vedas say. But the Vedas say, look, you're going to reach that after 32 trillion incarnations. And, Patanjali probably doesn't seem to be in any particular hurry to get there. Yeah. But obviously, Patanjali, the Yoga Sutra, seems to think that it's good to have as many different spiritual experiences because they inform you when it comes to your dharma. Yeah. That is to your right action. But let me just throw in quickly why an experience that I have just described, sort of this experience of reality in its entirety, why that could be psychologically helpful while you're still alive. And so the reason why it is because it totally removes any fear of death. Yeah. Because it expands your sense of self to make you realize that there is really only one Atman. Yeah, in the Upanishads, Atman means the self, and that's exactly the same what Patanjali calls the Purusha in the Yoga Sutra. Well, let's say they are both models that are describing the same phenomenon. And when you come to that point to realize that there is only one Atman, one super self, yeah, of which all beings and in fact all reality partakes, at that point you realize, well, I don't have to be afraid of death because I'm actually immortal. The idea that I identify with this body is a misconception because this body in itself is only a small part of the super self. Yeah. So as I'm dying, I will continue to exist in everything else. Yeah. And so that's the psychological benefit of having this grand enlightenment. Let's just call it that way. This experience that there's only one super self. Yeah.
Well, is it possible to just dip in? Can you have some experience of the full reality, but still stay here and bring it back with you?
Yes. In fact, nothing but that is possible. It would be extremely difficult to stay in there. Yeah. And so the reason why most people can't integrate an experience like that is because they don't stay in there long enough. Yeah. For example, the Shiva Svarodaya, that is a text on pranayama, says that you sort of have a miniature experience of that every time when your nadi switches, your pranic flow switches from the left to the right nostril and then back from the right to the left. So you have that several times anyway. And so if you look, for example, in a text which is called the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, the Lord Shiva, which is the author or the speaker in that treatise, actually says, look, you really have this experience actually every single time in the breaks between two thoughts. Yeah. Because the thoughts are like clouds which are floating past in front of the blue sky of infinite consciousness. And every time when a thought passes and before the next one has taken hold in your mind, if you look through, that behind this small snippet of blue sky is actually that experience that we've just been talking about. So the problem is not having that experience. And I also believe that even the average human being goes every night between 11 and 17 minutes back into that state, which we call the deep dreamless sleep, in which there is total rest, the mind is totally shut down. So we all come out of that state and we all go back into that state, but our culture is sort of specialized on keeping us on a surface reality so that we don't look there, that we ignore it. It's almost considered to be a virtue to not look there.
Well, first of all, I think this connection you're making between experiencing some amount of this full reality and a lessening of fear around death, that certainly makes a lot of sense. Whatever amount of experiencing my own infinite nature, I've certainly find that there's that just a little bit of like a healthy removed where I can see it play out like a theater more. And there's not so much fear. That just seems to be a natural side effect of experiencing some of like interconnectedness or infinite nature.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be the one important psychological effect that experience has.
And one other quick thing, I'm just so curious because this is a little bit of an aside, but you threw out this number, 32 trillion incarnations. Is that a specific number that you got from somewhere?
Yeah, I think Ramakrishna quotes that at some point. Yeah, but Ramakrishna is sort of also famous for saying the Veda says, he said 30 trillion, yeah? But Ramakrishna was famous for saying the Veda says this and this and this. And then some scholars actually went back through the whole Vedas and it wasn't actually saying that. But because Ramakrishna was such an exalted sage, what he said became almost automatically a part of the Hindu canon. So I haven't gone through the entirety of the Veda to actually check whether the number of 30 trillion is actually mentioned, but the number, the common view is that it's almost infinitely large. So it's not 10 or 100. Yeah, it's an almost infinitely large number.
Gotcha. Well, the other thing that you talked about, which I think is an overarching thing for your book, is this idea that this sense of our infinite nature or divine intelligence, as you're saying, we've we've been cut off from that because of, you used this word that I really liked. I wrote it down, enculturation. Did I say that right?
Mm-hmm.
Enculturation.
Yes, enculturation, yes.
And I think that seems to be like an overarching idea that I think I remember first reading a book in college. I think it was called the Re-Enchantment of the World or something like that. And it traced back in time, sort of like Industrial Revolution and and the process of kind of like forming our cultural belief systems.
Absolutely, yes.
And that seems to tie into what we were talking about in terms of these perpetual filters that we have, or these perceptual filters that we have. The belief systems shape those perceptions.
There was a Canadian psychiatrist. His name doesn't come to my mind now, but he said that there's two functions in the brain. One is the thinker, and one is the prover. And the prover will always prove what the thinker thinks. Yeah. So, if you look at, for example, that extreme segregation that is currently taking place, for example, in the American society, it is also taking place in a lot of other societies around the world. You talk to some people and they sort of have gone down some particular rabbit holes, and everything that you say is to sort of weaken that position, to sort of try to break it open, to criticize, is again being used to enforce this position. Yeah, so it's sort of like an infinite regress. Yeah, so I'll give you an example. Let's say, as a male, you may hear, you may have heard during your youth or your childhood things like that women can't drive. Yeah. And then I recently saw a video in which there was a long, one after the other, row of traffic incidents where women did something stupid and caused an accident. Yeah. But then if you look at the statistics, women are actually causing less accidents than males, which now women are driving heavy construction equipment, bulldozers, they're flying airplanes, and often they are found to be less hard wearing on the equipment, for example. Yeah. But yet, for a long time, we were walking around believing that women can't handle those machines. Yeah. And so what is happening is that when you walk around with the belief system, women can't drive, every time when you see a woman out there making a mistake, your brain says immediately, hey, look, there, it's happening again. Didn't I tell you? That's what's taking place. So that means it highlights that, right? And it uses that to enforce an already existing, let's call it, tunnel reality.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's like the algorithms on the social media or whatever that, like, if you embrace a certain belief, then your mind, I think you wrote, I wrote this down, your mind cherry picks all the data
exactly
that's out there to support the belief systems that you've embraced.
That's right. Yeah. And there was published maybe 30 years ago, a really long time ago, there was a book published by Robert Anton Wilson, and it is called Quantum Psychology. And in this book, he suggests that you pick some ideologies which you despise, yeah, and then what you do is that you keep imprinting really intensely the tenets that are underlying this reality, and then you look what is happening. And what will happen, let's say let's say, for example, you would take a white supremacist, or you would take a fundamentalist Islamic or whatever, extreme fascist or communist, extreme tunnel reality, and you start thinking those thoughts really intensely. And so what will happen is, after a very short time, your brain will start to actually highlight data which supports the reality tunnel that you just imprinted. And you're thinking to yourself, I tried this over and over again, and it works every single time. And you're like, well, wait a second, I'm a kind spiritual practitioner. How can my brain suddenly highlight racist, fascist, or whatever thought constructs and data to support them? But this is simply because that's how the brain works. And so the reason why the brain works that way is for the purpose of survival and for the purpose of simplicity. To give you an idea.
Right, because we can't take in the full reality or we wouldn't function.
That's right. So I'll give you an idea. Let's say, for example, maybe you remember when you learned riding a bicycle or learning how to swim. If you can't do it, if you can't cycle, and if you can't swim, you feel like an idiot, and you feel like, well, how do I actually learn that? And then suddenly something clicks in, and what clicks in is really that your brain has sort of like, let's use the terminology, chunked. So it has grabbed a chunk of data and has brought that together, and from now on it can just push a button. It's like, okay, switch on the swimming program, switch on the cycling program, and it can immediately like open up the program, bang, this is what we have to do, and so this is how conditioning works, and it simply works that way for the purpose of survival. Is because if our brain didn't have that ability to do that, like to memorize a particular programming, we would have to learn how to cycle and how to swim every single time afresh. So what the brain does, it's like a computer. It writes a program. This is our swimming program. And every time when you fall into the water or jump into the water, the program switches automatically on. And within a split second, you know how to swim.
Yeah, it's funny that you use that example, because I have an 11-year-old daughter who not too long ago, just before the pandemic, really, the end of last year, I taught her to ride a bike for the first time. She had this bike that was a little too heavy for her, and it took like a number of tries, but I remembered the moment where she got it.
Yes.
And then she just had it after that.
Absolutely.
She didn't have to know how to learn how to do it again. It was just like once she got it, that one moment, she felt it, like it was in her body. She's like, I can do this now. She could do it now.
Yes. And so let's just say our social self, so the way how we walk around in a social field and communicate with individuals around us is very similar to the cycling program, only it's more complex, of course. So, right. For example, you go down to the shopping mall. You're maybe being accosted by a police officer, and there is some other things going around, but you know exactly immediately how you have to act as a social person. I'm so and so. You know how you have to talk to everybody. And right. So this program called Your Social Self will have, of course, perceptual biases, which may involve sexism and racism, and they may involve heuristics, which are shortcuts. For example, a shortcut is all black people behave this and this way. And so the reason why the brain functions that way is not initially for a bad purpose, but this simply exists so that you know how you react. Imagine, for example, you would be stopped by a police officer asking you some questions, and you would have to first think, who am I? Now, who am I really? So the officer asks you to show your identification, and you're like, really deep down, I mean, who am I really? They would probably like call the ambulance and put you into the mental ward. So actually you can't do that. You can't do a metaphysical inquiry, and in most situations, it's not feasible at all. So we use those shortcuts and perceptual biases for the purpose of survival. And I guess we have now come to the point where we realize that a lot of them are just really destructive and they don't work, and we have to change them.
Well, that's what we talked about last time you were here. We talked about stratified power structures and how people were being exploited. People were using people's survival perceptual filters to take advantage of people.
Yes.
And that seems to me to be still the case in other realms, not just, it's interesting not to spend a lot of time there, but we did, have that conversation 2 years ago. And one of the things that's changed is, some of those conversations that were very relevant at the time, I guess, aren't as pressing as other things happening right now when we're all stuck at home. And, I saw people like use that Patabi Joyce video as like a promotional tool, and like there was no uproars like there was 2 years ago. Seems like some of that conversation has, I don't know, been abandoned, or I don't really know what's going on in the Ashtanga world. People have kind of just gone back. You just don't hear that same conversation happening that was happening back when we last spoke.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Well, I guess, I have to admit, that's part of the problem of social isolation. Mm-hmm. I've also been the last more than a year. I haven't seen a lot of people, so it was really good for me studying, for reading, getting a lot of work done. But
I guess that explains it. Everybody's been isolated. So
that's right.
And a lot of people, myself included, abandoned social media time too. So if you're not on social media, then there's not that same thing happening. And I guess a lot of it, frankly, was for me just like my mental health. Like everything seemed so very difficult and challenging and trying and uncertain. You can't. You have to choose what you take in because it affects your perceptual filters, as we're discussing.
Yeah, very much so. And I guess the problem with social media is, to be honest, I never had, for example, what's called a Facebook profile. So I have a Facebook professional page, but I've never had a profile where I constantly have to see what other people are posting. So so I'm spending a lot of time every day reading news websites, trying to make sense of the world. But yes, I also noticed I'm a bit socially isolated at the moment.
Well, to that point of like trying to make sense of the world by like reading news on the internet, not so easy to do. There's a lot of conflicting information. It's hard to know what sources to trust. And I mentioned earlier that, and something I wrote is trusting my intuition delusional. It's like a blog post I wrote some months back because I just felt like at a certain point, some of these decisions I was having to make, even just like in terms of, do I put my kid in hybrid or do I keep them home and remote? Like, because I couldn't get straight answers and I could read experts on both sides, like credible peer-reviewed studies, saying different things. At a certain point, I felt like it has to come from a place I have to make this decision from within me. That there's like a place in me that has to come from a place of knowing, but to acknowledge that we all have these perpetual filters. And then to also say, but there is a place of knowing inside of us is potentially problematic. And it was one of your bullet points for your new book. It said, how do we know if it's the right voice?
Okay, so...
Is that what you were talking about? I don't know what that was referring to, but to me, I was like, oh, is that about how do I know that this voice that's telling me this is the right thing is not some bullshit shit that got planted in me by a Facebook post?
That's right. And so, I guess it's really important that we first state that the capability of human beings to bullshit themselves is almost infinite. Yeah, I think that's really, really important to state. Yeah,
Yes,
because
it's
it
in the
can be,
sutras, I'm sure.
yeah, definitely. It's like an ancient sacred shastra. Yeah, because the other thing is, of course, I have to ask myself, how do I know? How do I know that I know? And then I have to ask myself, how do I know if I'm right, if I'm wrong? I think that's the most important thing. That means you need to have a strategy. I mean, we are talking about a few different things here, aren't we? But seeing with this whole thing, that with this whole segregation that our society is undergoing, this whole breaking up, where there are these extreme factions of society which are constantly sort of totally withdrawing and shutting themselves off to other parts of society. I think in that context, when we're talking about that, it's really important that I think about what's my strategy to figuring out when I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. Because I've recently talked to a lot of people, they don't have one. They actually don't have one. You can tell them whatever you want, and their response is always, but this is something which is fostered by the mass media, yeah, right. Which is an argument that can be said for absolutely everything. Or this is something which you have been brainwashed, they say to me, by the deep state, or this is the lizard overlord Bill Gates, etc., who has planted this thought in your mind. So, and when I'm talking to them, I realize that they don't have a strategy for themselves to figure out that they are wrong, because we need to sort of realize that a lot of thoughts in our life that we have thought were actually wrong. I mean, at least in my case, my whole life is a long procession of wrong and false beliefs, And if there was a grace and a virtue at all in my life, then it was the ability to admit to myself that I had bullshitted myself yet again. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which I think that's really important, that you sort of have a strategy in place for that. Yeah.
So when you say strategy, like beyond just being able to admit that you're wrong, like if you are someone who knows like, I could be wrong, and you would listen to others and then take it in and be like, oh shit, I'm wrong. Beyond that, when you say a strategy for knowing that you're wrong, what do you mean? Is there something more than just being able to admit it if someone shows you that you're wrong?
Yes. Yeah. Look. I'll tell you a couple of really easy things that I'm doing. I'm trying, for example, to read the news in more than one language, and I'm trying to read the news on websites and news outlets that have different political configurations, different governments, and certainly different countries behind them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so if I find a story almost consistently on all of them, I must say that there is a very high likelihood that this story is right. Yeah. Whereas if there is a story that only appears in one of them and it's not being picked up by any of the others, I take that as evidence that this is probably like a self-serving story that this particular outlet wants to feed me because it suits their own agenda. Yeah, that would be sort of like a very simple but very, very effective strategy. Whereas if you take information only from, let's say, Facebook and Google, who have already quantified via artificial intelligence what you're believing already, then you're committing almost sort of like a form of, let's call it, intellectual incest. Yeah, you're feeding yourself always with the same rubbish over and over again. So you got to use some things that actually are challenging the reality tunnel that you already have.
I get it. I get it. I have a strategy, but it's not, I don't speak different languages. So I can't read it in different languages. But what I have done, to the point, to some of the things that you've said today already, is that what I've tried to do is sort of try on the other viewpoint. Like, if you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.